The Railway series, one of the longest running book series known to man and engine-kind alike, beginning in 1945 and its last instalment being in 2011. That's a lot of books, folks, and I'm here today to not rank the books, but the stories. Yes, you had that right, all 169 stories by my count are going to be ranked by me across a two-part series on the channel. I am Peter Sam, and you're watching a long-ass motherfucking video. So as I just explained, I'll be ranking all 169 stories from the Railway series. To accommodate for such a big undertaking, I've decided that this project shall be split into two videos. The first video shall be me discussing all of the Reverend stuff, and part 2 will focus on Chris and the final massive list. My method to this madness is that I shall talk about every story in order and then do the worst to best list at the very end. Of course, I'll be giving you segment rankings every third book along, which ranks all of the stories I will have just spoken about. Credit to LS Mark for this superb format. I hope you understand, and if you don't, I'm sure you'll work it out along the way. Buckle up and come on this journey with me as I talk about and eventually get round to ranking every Railway series story from worst to best. Let us start with the most adorable of beginnings. The Three Railway Engines was written in 1942 but wasn't published until 1945. The stories were written by Reverend Wilbur Awdry to tell his son Christopher as he was sick with the measles. Awdry was eventually convinced to make the stories into a fully fledged book and set about doing so, but World War II was happening, so the book wasn't published until 1945. The publishers were reportedly unhappy with how Henry was never released from the tunnel in the book, so Awdry wrote a fourth story where Henry was let out, Edward Gordon and Henry. This book also was subject to multiple variations of illustrations, firstly by the Reverend himself, then by William Middleton, and finally by Clarence Reginald Dalby, who would go on to illustrate another 10 of Awdry's books. Honestly, looking at all of these illustrations, it's clear that Dalby had the most talent out of the three. Awdry's no artist, and Middleton not only drew the engines wrong, but his illustrations had this washed out look that I'm not fond of. Dalby's not the best illustrator throughout all of the books, but his illustrations are the most appealing here in my opinion. So, now that that context is out of the way, let's speak about the stories themselves. Edward's Day Out is the first of these stories. So what do I think? Well, it sure is a story. I want to make it clear that I don't hate this one, but it's so simple and so basic that I can't form an opinion on this one. I think the biggest problem is the structure. Some of the pages don't have enough writing and others have loads, which I'm not a fan of. I prefer consistency with how much is on each page. The writing itself, though, is a great thing. It's no wonder that the series got as successful as it did because the eloquence and sheer style is so apparent even from this first story. Usually writers create their own set style throughout their works after some trial and error, but Awdry seems to have it locked down tight from the very first page. My favourite bit is obviously the bit about the guard being late. It's not hilarious, but amusing enough to make me smile and makes this very low-key story a lot more fun. Now let's move on to the next story. Edward and Gordon is much more spectacular in comparison. The writing here is beautiful, yet so simple that it's so clear why Awdry became such a notorious writer and carried on with this series. The repetitive nature of it is really what sells it, and the way that both Edward and Gordon speak while trying to get the train up the hill is quite similar to how a steam engine sounds in real life. I think the best aspect of the writing here is what Edward learns. He learns that not whilst everyone will change their opinions, no matter what, at least he knows that he is useful and of worth. Gordon is also characterised very well, and it's so clear that Awdry knew exactly what he was doing with him from the start. I'm not talking about his series-long arc, I mean in terms of what he says, how he acts, and how he reacts to certain things. Also, it seems that the structure problem is fixed. There's a lot more writing dedicated to each page, and it's a lot more evenly spread too, so well done, Awdry. I'm putting this story above Edward's Day Out. Oh no! A page with only 2 lines is what I thought when looking at the first page of The Sad Story of Henry, but then I realised that it was being done for pacing and storytelling effect, which I greatly appreciate. In terms of writing, most of what I said in regards to Edward and Gordon can be applied here, but I think there is clear humour with the fat director and doctor remarks. We all know what I'm talking about. Whilst it didn't make me laugh because I've heard it so many times over, I can appreciate it being there and sets the story apart from the rest. Well, that and the fact that the story is so blasé about putting a wall in front of the tunnel so Henry cannot escape. I feel like that should have been the thing to focus on in this one, not the attempts of getting Henry out. Like, what the shit? It's mentioned in the last page and then we just move along to the next story. Not a big fan of that. I'm putting this story under Edward and Gordon, but above Edward's Day Out. Oh, by the way, I should mention that if you're expecting this to follow the episode rankings from the show, then don't, because I just put this story above a story where the episode adaptation is ranked lower than that of this story. Just because I really like Old Iron as an episode, it doesn't mean that it gets a free pass this time round. Just because I rank the episode Home at Last really low as an episode, it doesn't mean I'll put it there in this list. There are limitations to the episodes and there are limitations to the stories which make one or the other stronger. Keep that in mind. Edward, Gordon and Henry is a great finisher to the book and gives off a very heartwarming tone, with Henry being freed from his tunnel, Edward getting to help pull the express and Gordon being helped by both of them. Again, the writing's really great, with some great humour involving the Fat Director's hat, and the character interaction between specifically Gordon, Henry and the Fat Director is quite nice. I do have a few minor issues, but they're nothing major. There's an illustration that depicts Gordon really far from Henry's tunnel, despite the writing saying that Gordon manages to blow steam at Henry. I'm not a fan of the ending as well. It just feels like Awdry wanted Henry to be painted blue, so he just made up a reason on the spot and didn't give much thought into how it would affect the other stories. Nowhere before this has Henry ever idolised Edward. All they did was pull a train together and that was enough for Henry to want his paintwork? Huh. I sense a new ship on the horizon. Anyway, that story beat just feels wrong, and all it did was create confusion, so Henry went back to being green regardless. So it's a reward that feels wasted in general. I'm putting it above The Sad Story of Henry, but below Edward and Gordon. So, The Three Railway Engines was a solid book. It's nowhere near the best in my opinion. The writing is good, although the stories themselves are rather tame when compared to a fish train going top speed into a brake van or a runaway train that ends up in a barber shop. But as the first book, it shouldn't be like that. A nice, slow entry into the series is nice and quite an easy way to become comfortable with the premise of trains with faces for kids and adults. The limited cast of characters makes this all the more easier, and despite its darker tones at some points, it has a sweet ending with all of the characters coming together at the end. I think the word I'd use to describe this one is authentic. You aren't ever going to get more authentic with this series, with this franchise, than with these 4 original stories, and I think that makes it quite a powerful book considering what Thomas and Friends has grown into nowadays, with all of its backflipping BS. Speaking of Thomas, let's move on to our next book. Thomas the Tank Engine was published in 1946, and whilst he may not have been in the first book, this titular character managed to spark a worldwide phenomenon which still affects our lives today. Essentially, it's the most likely reason you're watching this video right now, and this book began that massive path to TV, cinema screens and theme parks. But are the stories within this book really a masterpiece, or are they just overrated garbage? That's what I shall be answering right now, folks. Thomas and Gordon is the first story of the bunch, and is a prime example of a perfectly decent story. It's not insanely morbid or serious like later stories, or even in any way exciting, but it was still entertaining to read nonetheless. I would say my biggest gripe is the lack of mentioning just how far Thomas travels. I would have liked to have seen a page that described how far Thomas went, with a pretty illustration to coincide with it. Instead, the story just feels a bit rushed as a result. At least I can praise the writing for still adhering to its very noticeable style, and the illustrations for being so beautiful. Especially that very first one, which is just of Thomas. I enjoy that one a lot. I know it's something I may talk about a lot, but as we get to the later books you'll understand why I'm doing so now. I'm putting Thomas and Gordon at the top of the list so far. I had a lot of fun with this one. I was very surprised to see that Thomas's Train was a story I actually ended up liking more than the episode adaptation. It's perfectly paced and keeps those great aspects I previously touched on. However, like the episode, I can't say much else besides that. It's just one of those stories that's so simple that you don't need to say much, if anything at all. It's going under Edward, Gordon and Henry, but above the sad story of Henry. I'm as surprised as you are about that, trust me. Thomas and the Trucks is definitely my favourite of the story so far, and has that great pacing that the previous story had, and applies it to an exciting, well-illustrated runaway that, whilst isn't the greatest Awdry has ever written, was certainly entertaining nonetheless. This is the reader's first taste of true excitement with what the books had to bring, with all of its crashes and all sorts. The element of Thomas wanting to see the world that seems to be crammed down our throats is really at its peak here, as Thomas gets that taste of freedom that he so desires. But with that freedom comes responsibility, as I'm sure you've heard me discuss before when I spoke about The Adventure Begins in the film rankings. That is Thomas's true arc, and it's an arc that will be fulfilled in the very next story that we look at. Thomas and the Breakdown Train immediately tops Thomas and the Trucks. I understand that a lot of people love that Adventure Begins has Thomas actually earn his branch line instead of just clearing up an accident, but I actually prefer this version, and here's why. As I said, Thomas's arc is about responsibility, and what's more responsible than acting sensibly in the face of fear and working your socks off to help someone in need? Chasing after James is something Thomas 2 stories ago would have done, but getting the Breakdown Train and teaching the Trucks a lesson, as the book words it, shows growth with his character. And that's clearly what the Fact Director must have seen, because that's why he gives Thomas a branch line to cap off this arc. I know it's a bit of a stretch, but so was the chase sequence. I don't think either variation gets the arc spot on, but I know when it comes down to it, I'm backing this variant all the way. This story is a rewarding treat at the end of the book, and is a fun, exciting ride that contains the first crash of the series. A fitting end to the book, in my eyes. So, is Thomas the Tank Engine worth the hype it gets, or is it just overrated nonsense? Well, I have to argue that it is absolutely worth it. At the time of the book's release, there was nothing else like it, not even in the previous book. The 3 railway engines took on multiple arcs and didn't really have any major advancements in character. This book, however, purely focuses on one character and his journey to reach his goal, whilst learning other things along the way. So in my eyes, it's no wonder that this book got as big as it did. In the words of the Nostalgia Critic, it's Thomas the fucking Tank Engine, and deserves to be remembered as one of the most influential pieces of media out there. I think that's the word I'd use to describe it actually. Influential. It influenced not only a continuation of the concept into other mediums, but also most likely other things such as Starlight Express, the abomination known as Chuggington, and Tugs. That probably wouldn't have happened without this single book that grew such a cult following over the decades. All I can say is, thank God it did. I just hope the next book is just as entertaining. James the Red Engine was released in 1948, 2 years on since the previous instalment of the series. This book is notable for being the least favourite of Wilbert's, saying that he wasn't allocated enough time to fully flesh out James's arc throughout the book. But is it the worst so far? Let's find out as we begin with the first story. James and the Top Hat is quite simple in all honesty. It shows James's first experience with coaches and starts that dynamic between James and Edward, but there's not much substance there. The story is also basically just James reacting to things. The Fat Controller's hat gets wet, so James hurries away. Edward tells the story of Edward and Gordon, so James laughs. Edward and James pass the site of James's previous accident, so James whistles at the cows in the field. It doesn't help that the illustrations have had a bit of a quality dip too. It's going at the bottom of the list so far, because at least Edward's Day Out had the amusing bit with the guard being late. James and the Bootlace isn't amazing either. It's better than the previous story for sure, as it has an amusing few pages with Jeremiah Jobling, who refuses to give up his bootlaces so that the train can carry on, but the illustrations are still weak, and whilst the style of writing is still there, with the story being another simple, boring one, it just doesn't have the same effect as something like Thomas and Gordon, which has great character dynamics and is a fun tale of revenge. If it wasn't for that sequence with Jeremiah Jobling, this would be going at the bottom of the list so far, but because it's in there though, I'll put it above Edward's Day Out, but below the sad story of Henry. Troublesome Trucks is our third story this time round, and whilst once again it is better, it's far from perfect. This story is entertaining for sure, with James's trucks breaking away on the hill, but the problem is with what point we are at in James's arc. James has already learnt his lesson, as told to us in the first page, so this story is more about James proving himself to the Fat Controller, which is fine, but this should really be the last story, right? Especially because the first story is about James soaking the man's new top hat, so really James's arc for this book is done now, one story too early. Oh yeah, another problem I had with this one is that the illustrations suck ass, not because they're ugly, in fact this story has the best illustrations in terms of beauty out of the three so far. I mean they suck ass because they're either not detailed enough or they're failing to demonstrate what's happening in the story. In one page, Edward's face is fully gone. I know he's in the background, but you could just add a little detail, couldn't you, Delby? In another page, it says that Edward puffs by and that the Fat Controller was on board Edward's train, yet in the illustration, the Fat Controller is walking towards James coming from another direction as Edward is puffing past. It's so confusing. Anyway, I'm putting this story between Edward, Gordon and Henry and Thomas's train because it was at least entertaining. Despite the minor plot convenience in James and the Express, I really liked it. Not only does it integrate James into the fleet some more and make him feel like a real member of the railway, but it gives some great development to Gordon the big engine. In Edward and Gordon grumbles about pulling trucks, and yet in this story he ends up shunting in the yard and not complaining about it. I'm sure he still hates it, but the fact he isn't complaining or arguing about it shows great development to his character already, and we're only 3 books in. My gripe with this story is how quickly James is just handed the Express, not too dissimilar to the gripe that others have with Thomas and the Breakdown Train. It's not like Gordon can't pull the Express, he just got sent down the wrong line, that's all. But it's a minor critique of what is one of the best stories I've read yet, not just from this book, but from all of the books so far. James and the Express is going under Thomas and the Trucks, but above Thomas and Gordon. So we've completed all of the stories in the first 3 books, so you know what that means, and if you don't, it means you skip the intro, you dumb fuck. So that was James the Red Engine. I think it's clear to anyone that reads it that it was rushed and that this is the first of the quote-unquote bad stories we've seen. I'm glad that Awdry thinks that this is the bottom of the barrel in terms of his stories, that this is the shittest we'll see in a long while, because it means that we can only continue going up from here. Well, until we reach the Chris Awdry stuff, that is. The word I'd use to describe James the Red Engine is sad. It's sad that one of the best written characters in all of Thomas and Friends media has this as his introduction. It's sad that Awdry never had time to craft his story intricately enough and had to satisfy his publishers. And finally, it's sad that the illustrations have taken a dip, so I don't have anything great to look at to take my mind off those weak and unsatisfactory stories. I know I said it before and jinxed it, but I really hope that the next book is better. Tank Engine Thomas Again was published in 1949, same author and illustrator, you know the drill. This book is focused on what Thomas gets up to along his branch line and all of the shit he encounters as a clear sequel of sorts to the previous book about him. Fun fact, this is the only book of Wilbert's that doesn't have a title that ends with engine. Don't know why that matters. Let's just dive on in. I'm sorry to say that we're not off to a flying start with Thomas and the Guard. It has a lot of the same problems as I mentioned in my Season 1 re-ranked video, with no true karma being instilled on Thomas, so it feels as though he can just get away with insulting Henry. I talk about it a bit more in that video, but that's the summary. Feel free to check that out if you want. Other than that, this story is fine. It at least follows a clear story and it's not just some moments that make up a journey, unlike a certain story from a previous book we covered. I'm putting this story below Edward's Day Out but above James and the Top Hat. By the way, I should mention that the segment rankings will only include stories that I talk about within that segment, but when I talk about where it goes on my list, I shall be talking about the list as a whole. Should have mentioned that earlier, but oh well. On to the next story. I find it insane how you can really love a story from the books and dislike the adaptation, because weirdly I really like Thomas Goes Fishing despite not having a fondness for the episode of the same name. There's comedic witty dialogue, great illustrations, and a little arc that Thomas undergoes that isn't as impactful as his previous one, but is still apparent enough for me to notice and enjoy. I really feel the worry of when Thomas starts feeling bad and steam starts gushing out of every crevice, and I love how cavalier Awdry is with just mentioning that they killed the fish and ate it there and then instead of just keeping it in a bucket or something. It may have already died in there though, to be fair. I don't know. One thing I have been noticing is some perspective issues with Dalby's illustrations, and it's getting more and more noticeable. There are a few pages in the previous story that had this problem, and whilst it's not as bad here, Thomas just looks off. I don't know how else to describe it other than that. Either way, Thomas Goes Fishing is such an enjoyable little tale and is going above Thomas and the Trucks, but below Thomas and the Breakdown Train. Now, it's no secret that I really like Thomas Terrence in the Snow, and I think the episode deserves more love. However, I can't say the same for the story. Of course, the perspective issues are still there. I found 2 illustrations from this story that have Thomas at nearly the same angle, and Thomas's shape is vastly different. In one illustration he's very stretched out, in the other he's more compact. It's so odd. But my other issue is with the writing. When Thomas hits the snowdrift, there's never any line that says that, which annoys me to no end, especially as the illustration for that page doesn't show the moment of impact either. Just makes the whole part of that story feel weak and rather anticlimactic, which is ironic as that's what most people consider the episode adaptation to be. Anyway, I'm glad to say that everything else I enjoyed about the story. There's great character dynamics, and Terrence still has that boss-ass bitch vibe, which is great. We simp for our tractor king. I'll stop. I'm putting it above Edward and Gordon, but below Thomas and Gordon. Thomas and Bertie brings this book to a fun close. Of course, whilst this story will never be as powerful as the TV adaptation, which has the moving things in it, you can still enjoy yourself reading this one, and I definitely had some fun with it. Once again, the illustrations are a bit of a letdown. It's so sad too, because there's a page in there with beautiful buildings and a very well done bridge, and then there's just Bertie there with his ugly ass design and face ruining the picture. However, that doesn't ruin the energy this story has. The events and little things that happen throughout the race make it more tense and more intriguing, as much as we all know who wins by now. The race itself doesn't take too long to get to either, and is a large portion of what the story is focused on, with the great pacing helping that. What's more, there's a great moral about sportsmanship in there too, as Bertie humbly and graciously accepts defeat. Thomas and Bertie is a great read, which is why I'll put it below Thomas and the Trucks, but above James and the Express. So, Tank Engine Thomas again turned out to be a pretty fun book in the end. I'll tell you something, I was not expecting to like Thomas Goes Fishing as much as I did, but there you go. In my opinion, whilst it's not as good as the first book, as that has an overarching character journey and a clear story with fun little hijinks sprinkled in, with said hijinks being just as and sometimes more enjoyable than the stuff in this book, the word I'd use to describe it is light. It's a fairly light read and is on the shorter end, I think. There's definitely less pages in it than in the first book. As well as this, the subject matter is fairly light too. The most serious we get is Henry's illness, and that only takes up 1 page. However, the lightheartedness is not going to last much longer as we go into the next book, where I've heard a few engines get a bit too big for their buffers. Troublesome Engines was released in 1950, same author, same illustrator, Percy's introduced, let's go. Henry and the Elephant is a delightfully fun little tale, however I feel like the writing is comprised of more contextual stuff than anything substance-wise, which is fine because it's the first story, but most of that context is centred around stuff only exclusive to this story, which sucks because I could have given it more leeway if it wasn't. That's my only criticism. I enjoy the illustrations of the elephant, and the story itself, once we get into it, is quite fun too. I'm putting it below Thomas and Gordon, but above Thomas Terrence in the Snow. Tenders and Turntables is another fun story. It's not quite all there, as the way it segues from a story about Gordon to a story about James is a bit messy for my liking. I honestly would have preferred this to be 2 stories instead of 1 and have the Percy story later on gone, but that's just my opinion. I also don't like how Gordon laughs at James for spinning round on the turntable and yet is very sympathetic towards him later. I guess you could call it Gordon being manipulative to get what he wants, but couldn't he have kept up the act all the way through? He did for Henry. Another thing I'm noticing is the illustrations are far better this time round. Like, holy shit, that drawing of James being spun round is unbelievably impressive. I'm putting this one directly underneath Henry and the Elephant. It's another fun story, what can I say? I'm going to reiterate what I said when talking about the episode adaptation of Trouble in the Shed. I do not see the point of having the engines going on strike only for Sir Topham to lock them up in the shed later on. Why can't we just have one scenario? It makes things less confusing. As a story, it's fine. There's nothing too much to talk about other than it's the story that introduced Percy to the line, and hey, Thomas is around, that's cool. The illustrations are still decent too. Can you tell I have literally nothing to speak about with this one? For me, this story merely exists. I'm putting it between Troublesome Trucks and Thomas's Train. Moving on. So we've come to the story. The story. Percy runs away. I'm notorious for being a bit mean to this one in episode form, but what do I think about it in story form? Well, it pains me to say this, but I kinda liked it. Well, like is a strong word, and I'd say I gained more respect for it than anything, but I still had a good time with it. I understand it now more clearly. This story is about the rift between Percy and the big engines closing and them becoming friends. I don't know how I didn't get that before, but I realised it through, weirdly, the one part of the story I critique the most. Gordon saying Percy stopped an accident. Gordon's making Percy feel better after being unable to stop and crashing into the bank of dirt. He is making the first move of friendship here, which is actually quite another groundbreaking moment for his character. It could be fueled by not wanting to be shut up in the shed again, but nonetheless it's sweet and I have a lot of respect for Gordon right now. And yes, the pun was intentional. I'm putting Percy runs away above Trouble in the Shed, but below Troublesome Trucks. Honestly, I never really had an opinion on Troublesome Engines previously, but I actually have a lot more respect for it now. In fact, that's the word I'd use to describe it. Respectable. Despite the character's actions, it's a respectable book and not one that's praised much, shockingly. I actually think it's the third best book out of the 5 so far. And I think even if the stories aren't always the best, the illustrations have really improved and developed this time round. Dalby upped his game and I'm impressed. But can that game continue to be upped even more as we delve into Henry the Green Engine was published in 1951 by the Reverend and illustrated by Dalby as per. This book is notable for having 5 stories instead of the usual 4, and is the only one to do so. As well as this, from this book onwards, all of the engines would have numbers, when previously, only Thomas was given such a privilege. Considering we have more to get through this time round, let's not beat around the bush and get on with the first story. Coal is fine, I think, and this might be a recurring problem throughout this book, that the story is a little too short. It doesn't put enough emphasis on just how dicked over Henry is because of his inadequately sized firebox. But there's a nice happy ending for Henry as he not only performs better because of his Welsh coal, but he manages to take the piss out of Thomas and get back at him for that remark he made in Thomas and the Guard, which I love. A subtle bit of karma you can find after you scratch the surface a little bit that shows you can never get away with being mean. I'm gonna put it under Percy Runs Away, but above Trouble in the Shed. Okay, here we go, The Flying Kipper. The episode is undoubtedly the best of season 1 for sure, but what about the story it was adapted from? Well, it's still really enjoyable for me. The illustrations are really nice, and there's even one of the crash itself, which is great. Although there are a few bits that leave me feeling a little bit off, such as how the crew in that brake van shoot into the air like Jack in the Boxes. That feels pretty unrealistic in what is mostly a hard-hitting story. However, besides that, and how keen Sir Topham Hatt is to give Henry a new firebox, I wonder if that's due to someone else's keenness to get rid of Henry's old shape. This story is delightfully fun to read. Although it doesn't go at the top of the list for me, I'm putting it below Thomas Goes Fishing, but above Thomas and the Trucks. I quite like Gordon's Whistle. It's a simple little story that gives Gordon some great comeuppance and has quite a few amusing moments, such as, but not limited to, that moment where Gordon passes Henry and can't look him in the eye, the passing mention of everyone thinking war is happening again, Sir Topham Hatt being unable to be heard over the whistle, and Henry's remarks at the shed that night. Despite me whining about Cole not being long enough, I like the short length of this story because it's fairly light-hearted and doesn't delve into any deep or serious topics, which Cole does do, so it needs more length to suit it. This story is just Gordon getting his just desserts, and I love that. I've decided to put this one above Henry and the Elephant, but below Thomas and Gordon. Percy and the Trousers isn't even a story, it's like 8 pages long if you count the sides with illustrations on. So obviously with the incredibly short length comes a problem with the story, it's not fleshed out like at all. We're never told what Sir Topham is doing at the station or why his belongings are in suitcases. Is he going on holiday? Is he having a tough time at home with the wife? Is he taking the milk and leaving? Who knows? As well as this, and I know everyone's mentioned this when talking about this story, but Henry is so absent from this story that I question why it's even there. At least in Gordon's Whistle, Henry was a secondary character that had his justice. Here he has one interaction with Percy and then nothing. This story sucks, it's going between Edward's Day Out and Thomas and the Guard. What a letdown. Now, I'm tired of doing all this work. I think someone else should take the reins for the next story. But who to ask? Someone that knows the book inside out and has a deep fondness for Henry the Green Engine.
Hey, what about me?
What? Iconic UK tontuber and lover of Henry the Green Engine, Rob the Green Engine? What are you doing here?
Well, saying I'm a lover of Henry sounds very wrong, but you did ask for someone to take the reins.
Fair enough. Go on then.
Gladly, Peter Sam. Being a Henry fan, I am of course an avid lover of his proudest moments, pulling the flying kipper for the first time. I've said in the past that this episode is the best in the TV series, or at the very least, it's magnum opus, but believe it or not, I read the books a decent amount of time before I first saw the episode, and the flying kipper was not my favourite of the 5 Henry the Green Engine stories. I know, shocker. That title went to Henry Sneeze, a story about a steam engine spraying ash and soot, essentially sneezing on some boys who threw stones at him. What 6-year-old doesn't find that funny and memorable? It's exactly like Wilbur Awdry always said about his writing. The slapstick is what the child will enjoy, and a little humorous dialogue is what the adults will enjoy. Although, Awdry might have gone a little too far with the dialogue for this one, because apparently a racial slur was initially used to describe the boy's appearance after the sneeze. But after Awdry made a public apology and removed the obscene word, that minor controversy can all be forgotten about, and we can go back to laughing at the Vandal's misfortune without offending anyone. This feels like a great conclusion to Henry's book, because after the previous 4 stories where we're feeling mostly sympathy towards Henry, this reminds us that he's not just sympathetic. He takes no nonsense from boys who scratch his paint and break windows in his coaches, he retaliates in humorous fashion. The fact that drivers suggest getting their own back instead of calling the police right there on the spot, it's a great character moment for the crew members, and the fact Henry doesn't give it a second thought. Sneezing on those boys is a minor victory, but considering everything else that happens in that book, it all feels like Awdry's way of saying, I hear you children, Henry is staying in my series, and I know exactly the character I want him to be from now on. He has weaknesses, but they're repairable. He has a backbone and can stand up for himself. He can be grumpy and unlikable, but also relatable and content. He'll be around to entertain all of you in my future books. Although time has passed and I've grown to love the Flying Kipper much more, the nostalgia I get from both the book and TV version of Henry Sneeze will always make it a favourite of mine.
Thanks, Rob. Henry Sneeze for me is going under Gordon's Whistle, but above Henry and the Elephant. So that was Henry the Green Engine, and honestly, it's got to be one of the best so far, right up there with Thomas the Tank Engine in my opinion. The word I'd use to describe it is fun. That's what the stories are, and while some of them couldn't have been as great as they could have been without a certain story about Percy butting in and ruining it, it's a charming little book nonetheless. Although I think the next book we have to look at is far more charming than this one. Toby the Tram Engine was published in 1952, and besides from introducing Toby to the readers, there's not much to mention contextually. The book number coincides with the number Toby's given, but I don't know if that was luck or not. Anyway, let's get on with the stories that make up this book, shall we? Toby and the Stout Gentleman is my favourite story yet. Not only are the characters great and have amazing dynamics together, not only are the illustrations beautifully done, not only is what's happening to Toby such a powerful and sad tale, and not only is the writing so crisp and humorous, but I love the little hint that the Stout Gentleman is the Fat Controller. I think in the episode the connection is clearly stated by the narrator, but here it lets the reader work it out for themselves, and I love that. But to go back to a previous point I made earlier, I love the dynamic between Toby and Stephen and Bridget in this story. Their interaction is short and sweet, and whilst it's never directly stated, it is implied that across the fortnight they're there, Toby grows a fondness for them despite their negative first encounter. The only thing I can possibly critique is maybe the cliffhanger ending is a bit too boring, but even then, seeing the illustration of the driver and fireman dancing makes it better. This one's going at the top of the list so far, I enjoy it a lot. Thomas in Trouble is quite good too. It's not nearly as impactful emotionally, but makes up for it with its witty dialogue and even more amusing character interactions. The best character in this story is clearly the policeman, and you get a surprising amount of information that is just there in the book, which I love. Like, did you know that the policeman is not from Sodor? I've read this book numerous times and never noticed that line before. I think that type of little passing mention seen throughout the story multiple times is what makes it so great to read, and you can find them littered throughout the story. And whilst it may have been inserted a bit too much, I find it interesting nonetheless. Do I really need to know what Sir Topham Hatt was having for his breakfast on that day? No, but it still helps the world feel more lived in, and helps Dalby with his great illustrations. I'll be putting Thomas in Trouble under James and the Express, but above Thomas and Gordon. Whilst Dirty Objects is definitely the weakest story from this book so far, that doesn't mean I think it's bad. The dynamic between Toby and James is not as interesting as that between Toby and the human characters encountered in the previous stories. And then of course there's the problem with the runaway. The illustrations just can't do it justice that the adaptation can. And whilst I'm not saying an adaptation is why this story is flawed, I'm just pointing out it's harder to get as excited from the thrill of it. It's just something that happens in the books and you're like, oh, okay. For me, the illustrations make this story, especially the one of James after having just hit the tar wagons. Look at that angle, and the background just makes the whole thing pop. I'm putting this one between Henry and the Elephant and Tenders and Turntables. Mrs. Kindly's Christmas is a sweet story to end on. I've said it before, I'll say it again, I love the interactions these engines have with the human characters. It's not a great Christmas story, but I don't mind because of the character of Mrs. Kindly. It's just nice to see this old woman's genuine care for these engines and their passengers, and how she manages to save them from the landslide blocking Thomas's way. My favourite bit of this story has to be the ending though, as we hear that Mrs. Kindly is doing well and has been given many great presents for Christmas. I think my only problem with this story is the fact that Toby's not really in it. Why couldn't it have been Toby's train that Mrs. Kindly saved from the landslide? It just feels like such an obvious switch to make, but nope. Instead he's just shoved in at the end, and I'm not a big fan of that kind of treatment for the character whose name is on the book. It happened in the last book, and unfortunately the trend has continued. It also happened in Thomas in Trouble, but I forgive that because it brings Toby to the railway and you can't insert him into the story anywhere else really. I'm putting Mrs. Kindly's Christmas underneath Henry's Sneeze, but above Henry and the Elephant. Wow, this book blew me away. The sheer quality and beauty found not only in the illustrations, but in every word weaved throughout what I'm proud to call my favourite book so far. It only hits and never misses, which no other book out of the ones we've looked at so far can claim. I think my favourite aspect of the book is the way that the engines interact with the humans. Toby with Sir Topham's grandchildren, Thomas with the policeman, Toby and Thomas with Mrs. Kindly. It's all such a unique experience in comparison to the others. The word I'd use to describe Toby the Tram Engine is charming. As I said at the end of Henry the Green Engine, whilst that book is charming, this one takes that charm and turns it up to 11. Wow, the characters are endearing, the illustrations are so good, and the writing overall is just really cool this time round. I really hope that the next book can live up to that sort of praise. Gordon the Big Engine, believe it or not, is a book about Gordon. It was published in 1953 by the same author and illustrator as all the rest have been. I think we need to give a big thank you to the person that requested this book, Ian, as he helped the progression of a series-long arc for one of the best characters, as well as helping to give us some truly iconic stories. So Ian, if you're out there, I applaud you for just asking for a book. Anyway, let's talk about our first story, Off the Rails. Off the Rails is a truly memorable story, not only because of the crash into the ditch, but because of all the humiliation Gordon undergoes after the event. a family of toads sitting on him and being laughed at by all of the school children. Not only that, but Edward ends up pulling his special, an engine who has been constantly mocked, ridiculed and bullied by Gordon. That's some justice served cold right there. I think I honestly would have preferred if Henry had taken Gordon's special instead of Edward due to their interaction at the start of the episode, but apart from that I have no problems with this one. Put it under Henry's sneeze but above Mrs. Kindly's Christmas. Leaves is our second story, and honestly, I quite like it. It's quite a turning point for Gordon's character, having him shunt his own express train up a hill. Not too dissimilar to the story of Edward and Gordon, where Edward was in Gordon's position now. It shows growth of character, and I do quite like that. However, I have a few little problems with this story that make it not quite the best. Firstly, why is Gordon given the punishment of shunting when at the end of James and the Express it was said he no longer opposed it? Actually, that's a point that can apply to a few other stories too. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not fond of the human segments either. There's a whole page dedicated to James's crew discussing the situation at hand instead of actually doing anything, and it's quite boring, honestly. It doesn't progress the plot in any way, and all it does was refer to the Bincombe Tunnel, as if anyone's supposed to know what that tunnel actually is. There's also the bit with the cleaners at the start, which isn't as bad, but you don't need to name drop two completely random characters. The lore shouldn't have to be that deep with anything. I know this is kind of hypocritical considering what I said previously, but I feel like those stories can get away with it considering it wasn't a page long and didn't feel too random to me. Regardless, I enjoyed Leaves, and I'm putting it under Thomas in Trouble but above Thomas and Gordon. Down the Mine is another good one too. Whilst the illustrations of Thomas in the mine are odd, and the plot is very basic, with one character being mean only to get their comeuppance later, I still quite like it. It is probably the weakest of the book, but oh well, one story always has to be the weakest. The thing that sticks out to me the most about the story though, and I'm assuming it sticks out to a lot of others as well, is the ending. Thomas and Gordon decide to form an alliance to help each other in the next story, which I find to be quite a nice arc finished there. The two once bitter enemies have now become friends. Other than that, I don't know what else to say. It's going under Thomas, Terence in the Snow and above Edward and Gordon. Now we can move on to the final story. Paint Pots and Queens is a story that made me smile when I read it. It feels like a great ending to the book, and I'm surprised that it wasn't adapted for the end of Series 1 or put as the finale for Series 4 either, because it makes for a great final story, with the Queen coming to Sodor as part of her coronation. I'd say the one problem is that it doesn't feel like a Gordon story as much as it feels like a story about all of the engines, but Gordon still has a more major role than some of the other engines. The Henry segment is fine, although a bit boring. I feel like Sir Topham should have picked Gordon over Henry anyway without the paint thing happening, as karma for Henry insulting Gordon in the first story. The best bit though has to be with Percy getting really excited over the Queen. It's so sweet and yet so amusing that it just makes the book for me. I'm putting it in between Toby and the Stout Gentleman and Thomas and the Breakdown Train. So, Gordon the Big Engine was not as focused on Gordon as I would have preferred it to have been. In comparison to the next book we're about to look at, it is very focused. In a word, this book is strong. It strengthens its character dynamics, arcs, and it has strong moments seen throughout all of the stories. Not one of the stories got that low down, and some of them are the most memorable stories from the entire Railway series. But will the next book give us more of that? Or will we be stuck with more mediocre stories? Let's find out. Edward the Blue Engine was released in... Actually, you know what, let's play a little game. Like one of those really bad calling all engines learning segments. Can you guess when this book was published? If you said 1954, congratulations! You can use context clues to estimate a piece of information. You're not getting a medal from me. Cows is fine, to be honest. It has an amusing payout for Gordon and Henry, but this story really isn't about Edward. It's a trend I'll come back to regularly for this book, but it's worth a mention here because it's the first story. Edward is in the first bit of this story, and then the focus skewers to Gordon and Henry, who get their comeuppance. Nothing much to talk about besides that. I'm putting Cows under Edward and Gordon, but above Edward, Gordon and Henry. Bertie's Chase is a fun story, although it's not absolutely amazing. Again, this isn't really about Edward, it's more about Bertie and his dedication to passengers that aren't even his. This is great character development for the bus, as we've only seen him in one story before this, so I'm still glad this story is in here. Although I would have preferred it if Bertie had to conquer more difficult challenges to get to Edward. Maybe he gets stuck at the end of a traffic jam and has to take a very risky shortcut or something that spruces up the story and makes it all the more tense. But it does its job well, and serves its purpose. I'm putting this story in between Thomas Terence and the Snow and Down the Mine. Despite Trevor's weird phrasing for his appreciation for infants, Save from Scrap is definitely the best so far. Trevor's very sympathetic despite his odd phrasing as previously mentioned, and it's great to see him go from being so miserable to so glad. It's quite sweet and adds a nice wholesome feeling to the story. Again, Edward's not the main character, but when you have a story like this, who cares? I think my only criticism is that I wish we would have seen the vicar sooner, or maybe met him in a previous story. That's it really. This one's going under off the rails but above Mrs. Kindly's Christmas. Now for the final story. Old Iron is another really fun one. I love the dynamic between James and Edward here, and the way in which the story is set up with the mention of a race creating payoff in a way you wouldn't necessarily expect reading it for the first time. And in this story we have Edward's clanking being repaired, as well as James finding respect for Edward, as well as the other engines presumably, which is great to read. But of course, what would this video be without mentioning that boss-ass inspector risking life and limb, dangling off Edward's front to stop James like he's something out of John Wick. He's simply the Jason Bourne of the Railway series universe. Despite all that, I'm not a big fan of the fathers beating their kids, but it's one line, I'll get over it. Old Iron is going under leaves, but above Thomas and Gordon. Now that we've spoken about 3 books in a row, you know what time it is. So, what do I think about Edward the Blue Engine? Well, it certainly exists. I don't like the fact that Edward just takes a backseat and the shit happens around him. Nothing is ever initiated by Edward and he never does anything wrong either. That's sort of a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because it's easier to like him when he's written them that way, but it's a curse because it's really hard to write a story about him. The word I'd use to describe this book is typical, and not in a bad way either. It's your typical Awdry book with decent stories that you can enjoy, but it's not exactly a masterpiece in literary fiction either. It's a very mid-tier book for me, and certainly not the best by a mile. But will the next book be as we delve into the wonderful world of the Skarloey Railway? Four Little Engines was released in 1955, 10 years on from the first book's release, and I've always been fond of this one. It features an all-new cast of characters, Skarloey, Rheneas, Sir Handel, and the mad lad Chad himself, Peter Sam. But let's see if their first book is as good as I once believed it to be. I might get some shit for this, but I don't like Skarloey Remembers. It's just really odd and the exposition is so pointless, considering Skarloey is telling all of this to Edward, who has visited their line before and has probably heard most about what Skarloey is saying. If this was Thomas talking, this would be a different story, but it's not. Also, some of the dialogue is so odd. Skarloey's talking about Rheneas and how sad he is, and Edward just goes, "Oh, so do your coaches have names? Like what? Edward, please support your friend." It's not like the exposition is anything handy or useful to know either. Well, the bit about Rheneas is, but apart from that, we really could have learnt all of this as we go instead of cramming it in here and wasting a story. Another thing I've noticed, which now that I think about it can apply to some of the previous books too, is just how desaturated the illustrations have become. They're so ugly and it makes reading this story even more difficult. Despite that shit, I immediately really like Skarloey though. He's quite likeable yet sympathetic at the same time, so that helps the story. I'm putting it under Trouble in the Shed, but above Thomas's Train. Sir Handel, on the other hand, is quite enjoyable, although not perfect. Sir Handel's character and his interactions with the coaches, Gordon and the Thin Controller respectively, are quite enjoyable to read. However, I think the story is a bit too long, as there's not really much of a plot to be had here. It's just Sir Handel doing stuff and reacting to it, which is fine, but that type of plot only works with the shorter stuff. However, those interactions I mentioned earlier really do save it from ending up lower down on the list. I'm putting Sir Handel between Mrs. Kindly's Christmas and Henry and the Elephant. Peter, Sam and the Refreshment Lady is another great one. It has better structure and plot as well as having some great interactions too. I love how the coaches are so quick to grow fond of Peter Sam and how easily he's tricked by Henry. It makes for some entertaining reading. However, to be honest, the story is a little stretched out in my opinion, but then again it's nothing major. Overall, it's another good one and probably the best so far in this book. It's going above off the rails but below Henry Sneeze. Rounding off this book is Old Faithful, and not only is it the best story from the book, but I'm glad to say it's one of the best so far. Skarloey is in his element here and stops at nothing to get the train home. He even pops a spring and still carries on. That sort of determination just shows such strength of character, and that's why this story is so good. I also like how Skarloey handles the coaches here. He may not like to handle all that much, but he still gives them a stern word for bumping him because it's what's best for the railway. The sheer dedication astounds me, and even in book form, that ending still hits home for me as one of the most wholesome endings ever. It's not as good as the TV adaptation because there's an extra bit in there about Sir Handel having learned how to handle the coaches properly, which takes away from it a bit, but it's a nice way to pay homage to the guy. This story got really high, coming fourth so far, between Thomas and the Breakdown Train and Thomas Goes Fishing. I finally remember why I like this book so much. So, Four Little Engines is a very mixed bag. We have one boring story, two decent ones, and one amazing one. As a result, I'd say this book is very diverse in its quality and how it can go from something really odd to really wholesome. I'd say this book isn't as good as what I thought it was previously, but it's still not the worst in the world. Will that same opinion form with our next book, I wonder? Percy the Small Engine is the 11th book in the series, being released in 1956. This book is notable for being the last to be illustrated by Clarence Reginald Dalby, as Awdry was unhappy with his work for a while, and looking at the previous two books especially, I'd have to agree. His work was never the most amazing thing in the world, and whilst that doesn't necessarily mean it's always atrocious, at times it could be. Dalby did do some amazing work, but I don't think it was ever going to be anything in comparison to what came after. But we'll discuss those illustrators when we get to them. For now, we have 4 more stories to talk about, so let's go. Percy and the Signal is your classic engine gets too much to handle and suffers an event that brings them down to size trope. Not that it's bad here, but it's just a bit of a cliche now. Again, it is very entertaining though. I like the way that James and Gordon get their own back on Percy and how well the three interact for the story. I also quite like the implementation of signals and how they work into the story. It's subtle but a nice detail that helps the kids understand the situation at hand and a little bit of knowledge on how real railways run. It's cool. But then there's the illustrations. Oh no. Some of the illustrations look so ugly in this story, and most of the rest feel boring and dried up, like the spirit of the series has died or something. Well, there is this one illustration of James in the shed with Percy running off nearby, which is really pretty, but aside from that, it's really dull. I can see why Awdry booted him out. Percy and the Signal is going above down the mine, but below Bertie's chase. The interactions are cool, but it's just weighed down by its very typical plot style and its ugly illustrations. Whilst the illustrations in Duck Takes Charge are better, I finally realised why they're uglier than they were earlier on in the series. It's those huge ass motherfucking eyebrows. They're so ugly and makes looking at these engines so difficult. There was a time when the eyebrows were not massive, and that was a better time in Dalby's career, that's all I'll say. As for the story itself, it's quite entertaining. The character of Duck is immediately stern but fair, contrasting the younger and more impressionable Percy, which makes for some great interaction. I also find it great to read the Fat Controller scolding the big engines for being annoying ass bullies again. All in all, it's a delightful little one and it doesn't drag out for too long, which is also great. I'm putting it above Dirty Objects, but below Henry and the Elephant. Isn't it mental how these rankings of the same thing can differ so drastically depending on whether it's in book form or TV form? Percy and Harold, even in book form, is just so clearly a rehash of Thomas and Bertie, but with a helicopter. That really takes it down a peg or two for me. Now you may say, well, isn't a race with a helicopter more interesting than a race with a bus? And whilst I can see where that's coming from? I'd argue that no, it isn't, because helicopters are so clearly faster than steam engines, so that wouldn't be very fair. This makes the fact that Percy won even more of a letdown, because we could have had such a cool and unique moral and perspective if Percy had lost, but nope. If this story had been written later on down the line, I guarantee that the race would have ended differently, and then Percy would have had to have learned about dealing with the idea of superior transport. The race itself is also rather boring, considering it's just Percy and Harold getting to the harbour. In Thomas and Bertie there were at least obstacles like traffic, level crossings, tunnels and hills, and that's why it worked. You can't really do that with a helicopter, but in the end it's still enjoyable, and it's not as if it's awfully written. I'll put this one under Tenders and Turntables, but above Thomas Terence in the Snow. Percy's Promise is an amazing ending to the book, as this sort of marks the beginning of Thomas and Percy's friendship in a way. We get the most interaction between them since Percy arrived, and he uses his principle of never breaking a promise to get the train home. That is so sweet, and that section of Percy battling the flood is so tense, and it makes reading how he overcomes that flooded section of track so triumphant. Not only that, but Awdry also uses this time to help us flesh out the relationship between Percy and Harold. Their dynamic throughout this story is great, especially that submarine remark at the end. Railway series Harold beats TV series Harold any day. In the end, because this story is so good, and to be fair, the illustrations weren't as terrible as they were previously, I put this story above Thomas and the Breakdown Train but below Paint Pots and Queens. The only way it would have gotten first is by cutting that section about getting wood for Percy's fire down, and adding more about Percy's journey to the flooded section of track. That's all. So, the word I'd use to describe the book Percy the Small Engine is Percy. It just encapsulates Percy wholeheartedly and in every aspect. We get the cheeky Percy that likes tricking the other engines. We get the victimised Percy who is bullied by the big engines and learns to stand up for himself. We get the grumpy Percy that doesn't like being mocked or teased, and finally we get the Percy who will stop at nothing to keep his promise to his friend. That's everything we love about the little guy, and we wouldn't have it any other way. I like this book. It's not the best, but it's certainly worthy of being praised, and I hope it's someone's favourite out there, because it deserves that. The 8 Famous Engines was published in 1957 and is the first book not to be illustrated by Clarence Reginald Dalby. As I'd said previously, Awdry booted him off the series and replaced him with John T. Kenny. Kenny's work is actually quite nice and is quite cartoony in comparison to other styles of drawings throughout the series. Whilst you would think that's bad, that's not to say it's like a 2D show where the trains jump the tracks. It still is quite realistic despite that stylization and makes it quite unique in that sense. I think that style is tuned down in later books, but here it's more noticeable. Either that or I'm just not used to this style yet, coming off the back of Dalby. Anyway, let's get on with the stories that make up this book. I hope they'll be quite enjoyable. Let's start with Percy Takes the Plunge. I know I've just spoken about the illustrations a lot, but I can't help myself. These drawings elevate the story and make it so much more lively and so much more fun. Anyway, the story itself is a great spiritual successor to Percy's Promise, having Percy be humbled after his heroic deed. It is sort of a shame that Percy became so conceited about that event, but this story is fun all the same. Such new ideas are put forward, like Percy trying to get the trucks to do what he wants and failing, and the references to other stories like Down the Mine and The Sad Story of Henry. It makes this story feel like a breath of fresh air really, and the crash is quite cool despite it just being still images. I'm putting it under Leaves but above Old Iron. Gordon Goes Foreign is a weird one. I get the joke that Awdry implemented in there as explained by the unlucky Tug, but who the hell would ever understand that? Hell, I barely understand it and I've watched that Railway series video of his multiple times. It's just a weird thing to base a story around. Speaking of the story, that's pretty dull as well. Gordon, Duck and the Big City Engine argue over what London's station name is, and then Gordon tries going, succeeds, and returns deflated because none of the engines were right. That story kinda blows. Basing a story off a joke, especially one that most of your audience aren't going to understand, seems like a bad move. The only thing that saves this for me are the great illustrations as well as Awdry's clever setting up of the final story, with that page about the newspaper. It's clever, and this is clearly Awdry's first signs of wanting to do something far bigger with the series. In the end though, I put it above Trouble in the Shed but below Coal. It's pretty low down, but then again, this story was never written with me in mind, so what do you expect? Honestly, Doubleheader has a few problems, which is weird for such a simple story. Firstly, the story itself is way too long. Why is it padded out so much? There's an entire section about Toby worrying about Henrietta which isn't necessary in the slightest, and all this really could have been condensed into a few pages. Also, what has this got to do with anything the book presents? Percy takes the plunge and Gordon goes foreign, at least dabble in the idea of the mainland with those engines that Percy talks to and Gordon going to London. This story has nothing to do with any of that, it just feels like Awdry added it in because he ran out of ideas. The story itself, other than that, is fine and perfectly enjoyable. I still believe You Can't Win does it better because of me, duh, but this is still a decent story despite how weirdly long it is. Doubleheader is going under Percy and the Signal, but above Down the Mine. The Fat Controller's Engines is fine, in all honesty. It doesn't feel like a story though, so much as stuff happens and everyone deals with it. It's rather odd. There's little tension to be had with whether Thomas will manage to go to England with the rest of the fleet, and this one generally just feels super rushed. I think that's also made clear through how short the story is, which is mental because Doubleheader is way too long. If that story had bits taken out and this story had bits put in, this book wouldn't have suffered as much. But I am glad to say there are still some good qualities in there somewhere. I do enjoy how meta this one is, as Sodor has always been portrayed as a real place, so I'm sure some kids would have written to Awdry asking to see the engines in real life. This story is a great way to go about fulfilling that desire. The ending is also quite nice, although I reckon some dialogue that shows Thomas's appreciation for managing to get to the station in time was needed. What a problematic end to a problematic book. I'm putting this one between Cole and Percy Runs Away. To be honest, while I could describe The 8 Famous Engines as a problematic book, I'm not going to because other books throughout the series are definitely more problematic than this. So instead the word I'm going to choose to describe it as is beginning. This book marks the beginning of John Kenny's beautiful illustrations, as well as those meta moments and referential moments that we'll come to see a lot more in Awdry's work later on. Not only that, but this book marks the start of those hints towards the future storylines that Awdry becomes renowned for later on down the line. So whilst this book isn't the greatest, it introduces a lot of new material to us, and I have to respect it for that. The last few books haven't been the greatest, so here's hoping this next one is fun and fancy free, which is what I would say if this was a Disney ranking, but it's not, so here's hoping the next one won't take the plunge. I don't know anymore. I'm trying. Please, someone help me. Duck and the Diesel Engine was released in 1958, with John T. Kenny being the illustrator for this book again. Nothing much else to comment on besides that, so I guess we should just delve straight in. We're starting this book off with Domeless Engines, a fun story with a great way to give Gordon his just desserts. I think the writing is really strong here, especially with the way the wind is described. It's not vivid or lengthy, but brief and gets it down to a T, and I can really appreciate that. The illustrations are great too, as per with Kenny, and we even get a little cameo from City of Truro. You never see his face, and we don't know if he has one, which is disappointing, but ultimately Awdry probably thought it was blasphemous or something. All in all, it's a perfectly enjoyable story with some good payout. Whether this story or the TV adaptation is superior is a very difficult question, but nevertheless I've got to put this one between Old Iron and Percy Takes the Plunge. Pop Goes the Diesel is the next story in this book, and it was quite fun to read, to be fair. Immediately, whilst Diesel doesn't come off as evil, you can certainly tell something's up with him. The way that Duck manages to make him make a fool of himself in the most subtle and sneaky of ways is such a clear demonstration of the similarities between these two fuckers. Obviously, we still want to see Duck succeed because we are viewing this story through Duck's perspective as opposed to Diesel's, but if you want more on how similar Duck and Diesel are as counterparts, you should check out the Unlucky Tugs video on the Railway series books, as he puts it into better words than I ever could. I really enjoyed this one, and it's going under Percy's promise, but above Thomas and the Breakdown Train. Interesting characters, an amusing story. What doesn't this one have? Whilst Dirty Work doesn't have amusing segments or doesn't shine a light on the two counterparts of the book as well, it still gives Diesel a great character and presents him as this malicious, manipulative engine that makes a great first villain of the series. There aren't many, and there hasn't really been one before, but as firsts go, this is a great first. These names Diesel comes up with made me smile though, in all fairness. A galloping sausage, old square wheels, and rusty red scrap iron are perfect insults for Gordon, Henry, and James respectively because they all hit their weaknesses dead on. Gordon hates humiliation, and to use language that makes him sound silly or not as elegant as he'd prefer is such a huge slap in the face, I'm sure. Henry had problems being useful in the past and has had his fair share of accidents, so to have his wheels be called square is essentially Diesel going for his weak spot there. And then of course James hates being dirty and is quite vain, so that insult is quite fitting for his character. Diesel so clearly did this to ensure Duck would be shunned, because he could have just called them something insulting on a basic level, but no, this dude for real spent time and effort cooking up the exact words to get to those engines, and they were just the collateral damage. I do still prefer Pop Goes the Diesel to this, but you have to see that Dirty Work is all about transforming Diesel from an egotistical show-off to a devious, snide, manipulative liar, and I love that. It's going between the Flying Kipper and Thomas and the Trucks. This book ends with a close shave, which is not without its problems. They're minor problems, but there's a few of them, so they stack up. Firstly, I'm not a fan of the barber's reaction to Duck crashing through his shop. It feels like it was done for comedic effect when it wasn't necessary at all and has no place in a story that feels so serious in tone. Next, I don't like how Diesel just leaves without a proper comeuppance, especially because this build-up for a big showdown exit was shoved into Dirty Work. It's just a bit of a letdown. Those are the two main problems. Now on to what I enjoyed. I liked Edward in this one. He seemed so nice and genuine, just a nice character in general really. I also like the runaway, mainly because it's the best written runaway so far. Again, it's very descriptive and yet is so brief that it's practically perfect. Then there's that sweet ending where Duck is welcomed back into the yard and equilibrium is restored. Just a beautiful way to cap off the book. In the end, I decided to put this one above Thomas Goes Fishing but under Old Faithful. Another great one in general. So, Duck and the Diesel Engine is probably one of the few books in the bunch so far that has no bad stories in my opinion. Each and every one is captivating in its own unique way, and those ways are very subtle too. That's the best bit about the book, how subtle it is with its messages, representations and ideologies. This feels like the first one to have a properly deep message, and you can clearly see Awdry improving with every book from now on, and that is great. He's really stepped up his game and I can't wait for the next one of these. Also, just to keep with the trend, the word I'd use to describe this one is captivating. Now let's move back over to my favourite part of Sodor, the Skarloey Railway. The Little Old Engine was the second Skarloey Railway book to be released, and the first to be illustrated by John T. Kenny. I think Kenny's version of the SKR is the best in my opinion, or at least it is now. My opinions are always subject to change. Anyway, let's see what stories make up this book and where they belong on the list. Trucks is a nice start to this book. Well, not nice, poor Peter Sam gets hit by a runaway bunch of trucks, but you get what I mean. The illustrations here are just absolutely gorgeous. The Skarloey Railway was always pretty because it felt like it fit into these snug hills of Sodor, but here they're absolutely beautiful, almost a masterpiece. This is why I love Kenny so much. Anyway, not only does this story introduce us to the Slate Quarry and the Incline, it also introduces us to Rusty. Well, I say introduces, but it doesn't really. I wish we did get a proper introduction for the Little Diesel, but we have no such luck. The story also does lack much structure, considering that later stories don't revolve around Peter Sam or the Handle as much, but the writing is still great and has that Awdry magic we all love. The writing really does feel like it's improving so much now, to be fair. Before it was good, and I do still think it was stylised and noticeable, but here that's turned up a notch, as it was with the previous book. This one's going above James and the Express, but below Thomas and Bertie, because I prefer the writing of that one just a little bit more. Home at Last is another quite odd one, but for different reasons. It's expositional, but it's not the first story, which is just so weird. I don't know why Awdry did that. I don't think bringing Skarloey back in the first story instead of the second would have changed much. All you had to do was swap around trucks in this story and it would have worked better structurally in my opinion. Of course, it's not all exposition, as Skarloey gets to meet another new engine, Duncan. Honestly, Awdry needs to stop introducing characters if they're gonna have nothing to do. We've got nothing from Rusty and now there's another character in the mix, really? And that's not to mention all of the rolling stock that's been introduced as well. Of course, this one does have its nice points, like Skarloey returning, but that's not enough to save it. The conversation with Peter Sam, as sad it is to say, is dry, and there's no witty commentary or arguing. I get it's expositional, but you could at least be a bit entertaining with it. Also, there are little mentions of Duke's old lines sprinkled in there, just showing how much thought Awdry put into this lore that he's creating for his series. The amount of effort put behind it is abundantly clear, but it is still expositional and dry. In the end, this one goes down beneath Gordon Goes Foreign, but above Trouble in the Shed. Rock and Roll is the third story, and I really liked it. Duncan and Rusty finally get some sort of light shone upon them despite being introduced earlier, and their characters are really strong. Duncan is rebellious and foolish, yet he isn't malicious like Diesel, and that's what makes him stand out. You'd think he's a villain because of his attitude, and yet he really isn't. At the end of the story, he apologises to Rusty and makes up with him. Speaking of Rusty, his character is really good too. We don't see much of it, but you can tell he stands for no nonsense, shown through his unwillingness to help Duncan after he falls off the rails. They're two really interesting characters, and what's more, James appears in the story to further rile up Duncan, which is great. I like his inclusion. Despite this one being just another one of those engine gets what's coming to him stories, Rock and Roll is really enjoyable because of the characters and their dynamics, which is one of the strongest aspects of the series. This one's going above A Close Shave, but under Old Faithful. Little Old Twins is a nice ending for the book. We have yet again more mentions of Peter Sam and Sir Handel's old line, as well as the railway being broadcasted on presumably the news to commemorate Skarloey being 95 years old. Poor bastard. There's quite a few good moments in there, such as Peter Sam's excitement pulling the TV train, or the Thing Controller threatening Sir Handel's life, like what the fuck. I'd say the last page is a bit out of the blue and doesn't fit into the story very well, being a page about Tallyclin, but fuck it, it's a nice heritage railway that deserves the promotion, I'll let it slide. This is just a very feel-good story in general, and I really did enjoy myself with this one. Apparently so did Duncan, because he's constantly smiling throughout the illustrations, showing he can at least enjoy something. Maybe that's Duncan's forte, being filmed, who knows. I'm putting this one between A Close Shave and Thomas Goes Fishing. The Little Old Engine is a great read, and is such a great time. It's not as well structured as I'd prefer it to be, but it certainly is enjoyable, and that's what counts. The word I'd use to describe this book is whimsical. All of the illustrations just give off this magical atmosphere that is so beautiful, and I'd love to be inside those paintings, like they do in Mary Poppins, and preferably not like they do in the original Witches film from 1990, just stuck in a farmyard, wasting away, eventually dying. But the question is, can the next book keep up this winning streak? Why don't we find out? The Twin Engines was published in 1960, and I had a bit of a problem with this book previously because of how hard it is to read. The Scottish accents of Donald and Douglas are implemented into the words that are written down when they speak. There's a word for it, but I've blanked. If you've read the book, you'll understand what I mean. But the question I'll be answering at the end of this book is, has my opinion improved? Well, there's only one way to find out. Hello Twins is a really bad start. There's not much to the story really, and all it does is set up that Donald and Douglas have arrived on Sodor and one of them is playing truant, as the Fat Controller puts it. There's little entertainment to be had from this story, and there is honestly nothing to talk about. The illustrations are good, but that's an obvious statement. I have to be honest here, the worst thing anything can be in my opinion is boring. It's the reasoning behind a lot of my ranking decisions and is what's at the heart of these kind of videos. And that is sadly why this one is going straight down at the bottom of the list. There's just nothing to say on this one. What the fuck is the missing coach? And by that I mean, why am I left with so many questions? Why is there suddenly this random coach that joins Thomas along his branch line sometimes? Why is the plan explained so weirdly? Why do the human characters call Donald and Douglas number 9 and number 10 despite never having done that to any of the previous new arrivals and knowing their names? Just why in general? Also, Donald and Douglas's speech is still hard to read. At points I didn't know what they were trying to say, which is mental considering I've read this book at least twice before. Not only that, but for a story called The Missing Coach, that part of the story comes second to a bit about Gordon and Henry, which wasn't necessary at all. It creates some fun interaction, don't get me wrong. but could you not have written those interactions into a story or stories where their characters were more integral to the plot, Awdry? At least I can give this one that point though. Good character interactions, and the Fat Controller is quite fun in this one too. I like his character. The missing coach is going in between Scarlowy Remembers and Trouble in the Shed. Okay, finally we're getting somewhere. Brake Van, a decent story. Overall, most of what is presented is decent, and I'd just be wasting time pointing out those features because I've already done so. So let's talk about the best part of the story, the spiteful Brake Van. He's not the most amazing villain in the world, but the way he interacts with Douglas and Donald is so interesting. It's never explained why that Brake Van doesn't like Douglas, which is a shame, but the story's already long enough, so fair is fair. To me, that small character's arc throughout the story of his spitefulness getting the better of him in the end is enough for me to justify putting this one above Percy and Harold, but below Tenders and Turntables. The Deputation is a great end to this book, and it's probably so great because Donald and Douglas aren't in it as much. It's more about the other engines than it is them and how they go about having a deputation. The character dynamics and interactions are great, and the way that you can see Gordon and Henry's opinions change with merely one line of dialogue is a nice touch, and helps the book feel more interconnected and linked. And of course, that final page is great to read. I think the character interaction is the main thing this story has going for it, but I think that's enough to slot it between Gordon's whistle and Henry's sneeze in the ranking. So, has my opinion changed? A little bit, yeah. It's better than I thought it was, but not by loads. As you could see there, none of the stories could break the top half of the list, but that doesn't mean it's entirely bad. Sure, it can be confusing, boring and odd, but it's also beautiful, character-driven and sweet. This one has its moments, just not as many moments as the other two books that made up this segment ranking. And as such, the word I'd use to describe the twin engines is mixed. This book is such a mixed bag of quality and makes the reading experience quite interesting. Maybe the next book will get us back up to speed with the consistently good story quality. Alright, time for this series to have its sweet 16 with branch line engines. This book concentrates on Thomas's branch line and the new face appearing there when Thomas has an accident. This book is notable for having Thomas have an accident purely so his running board can be changed to fit Awdry's vision of what Thomas should have looked like more closely. And Daisy's introduced as well, I guess. Anyway, are the stories within this book any good? Let's find out. We begin with Thomas Comes to Breakfast, and this is a pretty good one. I enjoy the interactions between Thomas and the other engines, and Thomas and the Fat Controller have a nice little dialogue sequence at the end. I like the illustrations that show the crash too, and all of the humorous little bits with the station master's wife, and Donald and Douglas's little cameo where they have a laugh at Thomas's expense. There's a lot here to like, and nothing really too bad about it. It's just not as deep as other stories out there though, and as such I've put it in between Trucks and James and the Express. A good start so far. Daisy is a good introduction to the titular character, and she does have a strong character, but the events that occur throughout the story are quite dull and not very interesting considering what sort of place we're at with the books. Even Donald and Douglas got a better introduction, and half of those stories were bad. Although, in fairness, they had a whole book, Daisy doesn't. Though you could argue that's all the more reason to give her more interesting things to do, or have more interesting things happen to her. There's some nice character interaction in there, but nothing mind-blowing. This one's going underneath Edward and Gordon, but above cows. I think Bullseyes is pretty successful in trying to be an amusing tale of Daisy getting her comeuppance. I really noticed that with this book it's at least trying to be more entertaining, more humorous, and I love that. Daisy's naturally cocky character makes her great for this type of comeuppance story where another character that's perceived as inferior by the main character gets one over on them. In this story it's Toby, and I love how he mocks Daisy when she's unable to shift the ball. Speaking of champion, whilst it wasn't really necessary, I do appreciate that Awdry goes to the effort of explaining why he's ended up up where he's ended up. This is something that happened in Cows with Bluebell the cow, but it wasn't as detailed and something that was only a few lines long. Here we have a whole page dedicated to it, and whilst I still think that may be a bit too much, I appreciate how Awdry is trying to make the world he's building feel lived in and real. The one thing I'd critique with Bullseye's is the way the ending is written. I feel like maybe Toby should have pulled that final one-liner about kids having a quarter of Bullseyes at the station, or maybe Annie and Clarabelle. They never got their payback for how mean Daisy was to them in the previous story. Besides that, I really like this one. It's going under the flying kipper but above dirty work. Percy's predicament is the climax of this book, the faster paced story with the runaway and the big crash. So how does it hold up? Could be better. I think the inclusion of that witty humour again distracts me from the actual climax and any suspense or tension to be had with the story. The mention of a cockerel losing its feathers just doesn't meld together well with the tone of the narrative. Neither does Sir Topham Hatt's remarks about Daisy and Bulls. Although that's not to say I didn't find some amusement from this story, because I did. The line in that story that suggests Percy was waiting a whole day before Sir Topham actually came to see Percy is quite funny to me. He was just sitting there all night waiting. And I would have loved an illustration that shows that, with Percy's bored, sleepy face and maybe an owl perched on his funnel or something. That sort of subtle mention is great and melds better with this kind of story than the more blatant comedy mentioned earlier. Speaking of those illustrations, Kenny has produced some of his best work so far in this book, particularly with this story. Believe it or not, I do like that illustration of the cockerel getting his feathers run over, despite me bashing it narrative-wise. And seeing those dents on Percy when he's perched on the truck is a nice touch. All in all, a fun one with little problems concerning its humour, going between Thomas and Gordon and Old Iron. This book was quite a fun one and I really liked it. Of course the word I'm going to have to use to describe it is amusing, because for the most part it is. That's clear to me where the effort and thought went with this one. Hell, there was such a concentration on it, it distracted me from the main narrative of Percy's predicament. But more than that, this book felt like a true look at those branch line engines, and each one gets a story in the spotlight. Thomas gets Thomas Comes to Breakfast, Daisy gets Daisy, Toby gets Bullseyes, and Percy gets Percy's predicament. These stories are a credit to those characters, and whilst I know later down the line there will be at least one book set on the Farquhar branch that I think is better, this one still holds strong. But until then, we're going back to the narrow gauge, baby, so buckle up and read the exciting adventures in Gallant Old Engine. Written by Awdry Still and illustrated by John T. Kenny Still, this book was published in 1962. Yep. So, should we start? I think we should start. Special Funnel is a spectacular start, a truly amazing little story. The story of how Peter Sam loses his funnel is quite entertaining, and I love how Awdry implements the Giesel into his work, demonstrating to his young audience how something on real railways really work. But of course, the brilliant writing, clever nods and funny rhymes come second to the absolutely fucking jaw-dropping illustrations in this one. This is by far my favourite story in terms of illustrations. The frosty winter is drawn so articulately and beautifully, and the colour really helps visualise Peter Sam's emotions in the moment. If there was one thing I had to critique, I feel like there should have been more pages to account for the slower tone this story has. Stretching it out more wouldn't hurt, but that really is just a nitpick at the end of the day. These words and my explanation can't even do them justice, and if you take the time to find this book online or buy it yourself, you'll see exactly why I'm putting this story so close to the top of the list, above Percy's Promise, but below Paint Pots and Queens. It's entertaining, informative, but most of all beautiful, and for some that would make it hit the top of the list, but Paint Pots and Queens and Toby and the Stout Gentleman are just far more impactful to me. Steamroller is quite rightly praised for portraying both Sir Handel and George as both being as bad as each other, and that's what makes it so enjoyable. I want neither of these arseholes to win, and by the end neither of them do. George leaves with the railway still working, so his weird preaching about railways being no good failed. And Sir Handel gets ridiculed by some school children, so all's well that ends well. Some aspects of this story that are shared with Special Funnel are clearly weaker than Special Funnel, but they're still good. The illustrations aren't as drop dead, but they're still really pretty. I like that one with the river flowing in the background, it's quite nice. The information about steamroller wheels and broad tyres, something that I think is real, that real engines have, isn't as front and centre or informative, but then again, if it was, I think it'd take away from the overall narrative. However, despite that, this one was still incredibly enjoyable. It's going between Old Faithful and rock and roll. I'd be lying if I said that Duncan's grumbling in Passengers and Polish didn't get old, because it did after a while. However, there's some great character interaction in this one. Scarloey and Nancy's bit at the beginning, Duncan's conversation with his driver, it's all quite enjoyable. To be fair, I think the character of Nancy is quite a standout. She's not just some nameless child, she's a guard's daughter and helps to make Sodor feel like a real lived-in place. Apart from that, not much to say really. A perfectly enjoyable little tale there. It's going between Mrs. Kindly's Christmas and Saved from Scrap. Gallant Old Engine, the story, is a wonderful end to the book. The story of Rheneas getting his train to the next station on only one cylinder with everything against him is such a grand tale, and it's so enjoyable to read. The way the characters in Rheneas' story, and in real time when Scarloey is telling it, interact with the world around them is so lifelike and so real. And whilst the illustrations aren't as pretty as Special Funnels is, they're still gorgeous all the same. This book was named after this story for a reason, because it shows the audience at home, not just kids, but anyone, that a little bit of grit and determination can go a long way. I think that with this kind of story, the televised version will obviously be superior because it has more features to its disposal, but that doesn't take away from the fact this story had a clear message, with lore behind it, and with such big stakes that they could have lost Rheneas if they never made it. Not only that, but this story has a heartwarming ending, with Scarloey and Rheneas, the best friends that could, reuniting at the end and everyone cheering in celebration, even the engines that have never met him, including Duncan. I bring him up because that's another good thing the story does, help Duncan evolve and grow as a character. With this amount of good stuff in it, I'd be hard pressed to find a flaw, and I can't to be honest, which is why this story deservedly and wholeheartedly is going at the top of the list. Toby and the Stout Gentleman, after 10 books of not being beaten, has honourably been dethroned. It takes a lot to do that, a lot that this story has. Well done, Gallant Old Engine, you did it. The word I'd use to describe this book is spectacular. No story here really is all that terrible, and 3 of them managed to squeeze into the top 10. That is unheard of, and is truly amazing, I think, and I'm honoured to say it's my favourite book so far. It has everything. Gorgeous illustrations, check. References to real things railways use, check. Witty hijinks, check. Tantalising tales that empower you, check. Likeable, earthy and realistic characters that interact with each other in the most entertaining ways, check. Double check and triple check. It'd be hard to keep up this level of quality the next book, but nevertheless I am excited to see what's next for us. Stepney, the Bluebell engine was released in 1963, written by Wilbert once again and illustrated by John T. What's that? A new challenger has entered the ring? Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, the ice climbers of the Railway Series world are here, Gunvor and Peter Edwards. Whilst I think Kenny will always be my favourite illustrator because, oh my god, have you seen Special Funnel? I know you have, I was just being dramatic. Anyway, despite that, these two will always have enjoyable, beautiful illustrations that the pair should be proud of. Anyway, let's have a look at what this book has in store for us, starting with Bluebells of England has some wonderful illustrations in it, kicking the reign of the Edwards off to a great start. However, this story is purely exposition. We get the lowdown on all that's happening with the BR and the abolishing of steam engines across England, as well as information on how Stepney came to Sodor, being rescued by the Bluebells. There's some great character interaction between Percy and Douglas in there, especially Douglas's corkscrew comment. I found that especially amusing. But other than that, this story's kind of one note. I'm putting it above Trouble in the Shed, but below Home at Last. Stepney's special is a bit annoying if I'm honest, in the sense that any hopes of a fleshed out story to do with this important passenger that arrived was dashed by like 5 pages of exposition about Stepney's railway. The whole point of the book is to promote the Bluebell Railway by having Stepney go on enjoyable quests, and Awdry's just wasted a good chunk of it on exposition and talking about other engines who have no bearing on the overarching plot. Despite the illustrations being pretty, those engines are the worst part of this story, and maybe this book depending on what comes next. Why should I want to visit the Bluebell Railway to meet the engines when I can see them in the illustrations? Again, shouldn't the point of the book to be promoting the railway? However, when we do get to the actual story, it's rather enjoyable. I enjoy the way that Stepney twists Thomas into not being mad at him via flattering him. That's fun. If only the plot was more in depth. Oh well. Putting this one under The Missing Coach and above Scarloey Remembers. What a shame. Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. Train Stop's play is quite a fun one. I like the character of Caroline, she reminds me of someone's grandmother. The chase sequence as well is also quite fun, especially because of the way it's been illustrated. It looks both realistic and cartoony at the same time, and that balance is struck nicely with that winding road that looks like torture to drive along. I think the only critique I have is that Caroline should have been introduced earlier, maybe in a previous book or story in this book. Other than that, it's a perfectly enjoyable one that you can have a lot of fun with. It's going between off the rails and safe from scrap. Bowled Out is that classic engine overcoming adversity story, but the adversity in this one is moulded into the shape of a diesel. Whilst he's no devious diesel, he's still a pretty interesting character, and I do enjoy that gimmick throughout of the inspector losing his bowler hat, only for the readers to discover the diesel sucked it up into his air pipe. However, the true best bit of this one for me is the ending. Stepney gets a sweet farewell with no Thomas in the illustration, which I found an amusing bit of attention to detail, whilst the diesel slides away silently, and that final line is his nail in the coffin. Honestly, one thing I would have preferred is Duck be replaced with Percy in this one. Percy was the one that started talking about the Bluebells, and he was really excited to meet Stepney, and yet Duck ends up pulling the express with him. Just feels like a missed opportunity there. Regardless, I still had a fun time reading this one, and I'm putting it between Henry Sneeze and Peter Sam and the Refreshment Lady. So that was Stepney the Bluebell Engine, folks. A clear effort to promote this heritage railway with some absolutely beautiful illustrations. The word I'd use to describe this one is disorganised, because it was. At least the first half anyway. This results in Caroline just being a character that appears and disappears just as quickly, and Percy not getting that arc finisher he needed in the final story. It's unfortunate, and it's where I have the most problem with Awdry's writings. Sometimes other elements he cares about more gets in the way of telling a good story, which shouldn't be happening with a writer with an anthology of books under his belt. Don't get me wrong, I don't want these engines to be anything but realistic, but your characters still need depth, arcs and other shit like that. Anyway, let's move on to the next book, and hopefully this one is an improvement, although I wouldn't hold my breath. Okay, before I go into the synopsis, yesterday I bought a train whistle. Check it out! Isn't that cool? I just thought I should share that because I really found it funny. Anyway, released in 1964, this book introduced the audience to a rack railway that climbed the mountains of Sodor. Once again, Gunvor and Peter were back at it again, drawing some utterly brilliant illustrations. Let's see what our first story brings. Mountain Engine is a good start to this book, I must admit. Despite its title being a bit lackluster, there's quite a lot to it. I honestly would have preferred it be called something like Caldy to help us remember the character's name. Anyway, I really enjoyed that segment where Caldy speaks about how his railway works and explains the story of how he stopped feeling fear with his automatic brakes. Whilst I think maybe that part of the story could have been good enough by itself, it helps make the exposition more interesting. I think the one part of the story I don't like is Sir Handel. He whines about the coaches again and says they ought to be scrapped, even though didn't it say that Sir Handel stopped treating them badly at the end of Four Little Engines? This feels like a regression of character to me. Despite that minor flaw, I enjoyed this one enough. Nothing amazing, but a solid beginning. It's going between Safe from Scrap and Passengers and Polish. Next up is Bad Lookout, and once again quite an enjoyable one. I'd say the only thing I'm not a fan of is the fact that the Caldy engines have faces on the backs of their cabs. It's quite horrific body horror to me, but then again so is the implication that an engine got broken up to see why he was acting like a twat, and the implication he died, and then the implication that the Caldy lied about that to traumatise Duncan and Sir Handel. This story is all kinds of messed up in the most subtle of ways, but I like that. It allows room for thought, and when you're writing for a young audience, sometimes that's all you need to do for them. Not to mention the audience that have grown up with the Railway series by now. So that's why I'm putting this story between Thomas Goes Fishing and Little Old Twins. I don't have too much to say on it, but what I do have to say is all positive. Danger Points is a clever little story in what it does to improve upon the book. Caldy is no longer passive in the narrative, he is active and straight up doing things as they happen in real time instead of telling events that have already happened. I feel like that's what held the previous two stories back a little bit. What's also clever is the parallels between the fictional Godred and the real Lord Harry, and yes, I do believe Godred is fictional, and that's because of these parallels. It's almost as if Caldy had predicted the future with his story though, and I find that fascinating. Anyway, both of their names have some sort of relation to power, God in Godred and Lord Harry, and they both have the same attitude, and they both befall a similar fate with differing degrees of severity. Either way, they both end up leaving the rails and endangering others. It's all very witty, and I think hopefully that this last story will improve upon the development of Harry, but until then, Danger Point is going above rock and roll but below Steamroller. And now we're at the final story of this book, Devil's Back, and as I'd hoped, this has some great development for Lord Harry's character. His name is stripped away from him, taking away all of that power before he gets a new name, a name that doesn't signify power or royalty, but one that will remind number 6 of heroism and strength, as he is named after a hiker who got injured trying to help his friend. All of that good literary technique Awdry uses with names in this book is a very nice touch and really helps this book come to an amazing close. I will say I am surprised the cover art for this book isn't from this story, because out of all of the Edwards illustrations, the ones in this story stuck out to me the most. Also, the ending's a bit rushed for my liking, but regardless, this is a true chef's kiss of a story and is a great way to end our time with these engines. I'm putting this one under Old Faithful but above Steamroller. It's a shame we never saw more of them, but I understand how writing again for that railway would be difficult. So Mountain Engines is definitely one of the best books so far, and whilst it's a shame that clearly so much thought regarding engine names, scheduling and the whole railway in general went to waste with no other books being made on it, this book still makes the most of that thought abundantly clear. That's why I'd say the word I'd use to describe this one is thoughtful. Clear thought and effort was put into it, from the use of names demonstrating power to the beautiful illustrations. I'd be lying if I said I saw this all the first time I read it, which is why I'm blessed I read this through as a reread. Otherwise, who knows, I may not have liked it as much. Very Old Engines marks the 20th volume in the Railway series. An impressive feat to be sure, but are the stories as impressive to match? Let's find out. We're starting with Crosspatch. Finding out Skarloey's origins is quite interesting, and the illustrations are just as interesting to match. We have Neil, the different time this is set in, Skarloey's cablish younger personality. But there are little things in this story that gave me an ick, so to speak. The mention of gravity just reminds me of a science classroom. Skarloey's want for coaches is quite cliche. Random people coming to listen to Skarloey's story too is a bit random. Don't these people have places to be? Despite that though, the story itself is pretty solid. I'm sticking it between Thomas in Trouble and Leaves. Bucking Bronco is next, and it's also quite decent. It's quite slow and chill, and I do appreciate that, but the thing I have to praise this story for the most is how it amplifies Skarloey's character and draws back to the previous book centering the SKR. Skarloey really does learn these lessons he's being taught, and that's demonstrated through his roles in the other books. It's not like Duncan, who will always be Duncan. Here he learns about how horrible the coaches can be and is given his cab and his back wheels at the end of the tale. It's almost like a metaphor for how he's changed. Anyway, Bucking Bronco is a well done way to show Skarloey's metamorphosis from a character more akin to Handel to the one he is today. I'm putting this one under Trucks, but above Thomas Comes to Breakfast. I'm in two minds about Stick in the Mud because I think there was a clear intention to create a parallel between Skarloey and Rheneas and Duncan and Rusty in this story, made especially clear by Rheneas' reaction to Skarloey getting stuck. But I'm not sure if I like how it was done, because to me it wasn't that subtle, so I'm unsure. However, I find everything else pretty enjoyable, and especially that ending. It's nice to see how Skarloey and Rheneas became friends as opposed to just two engines that work together. Also, that snail comment is elite savagery. I think I'll slide this story under Bucking Bronco for now. I don't know where else to put it if I'm honest. Duck and Dukes is quite an enjoyable end to this book. I always enjoy reading a celebratory story, as shown by my placements of Paint Pots and Queens and Little Old Twins respectively. And this one is no exception. Not only is it a heartfelt, wholesome celebration, but there's some humour in there too, with yours truly. Peter Sam, to me, will always be the best part of this story. His obnoxious asking and the Duke's response is just gold. The misunderstanding is a bit confusing for someone who doesn't know everything about trains, but it's at least explained better than in Gordon Goes Foreign, which doesn't actually explain its clever inside joke. Oh yeah, and it sets up Duke the Lost Engine later down the line, so I have to give it points for that. Duck and Dukes is going beneath Steamroller but above Danger Points, a nice one for me. Very Old Engines is a beautiful celebration of two much-loved narrow-gauge characters we've seen throughout the series, and it gives the book this heartfelt tone all throughout. Heartfelt is also the word I'm going to use to describe it. Either way, you have to appreciate what the book's doing, whether you love or loathe the stories, using a celebration to mark a real-world feat for the series. Nice one, Awdry. You know what you're doing, fella. Anyway, time to head back over to the big engines and see what they're up to. Mainline Engines, when we finish it, marks the halfway point of the entire Railway series. A very monumental moment for us readers, I'm sure. This book gives us the introduction of some new characters, develops some old ones, and even takes us down one of the more unexplored branches on Sodor, the Brendan branch. But are these stories worthy of getting into the top spots? I guess we'll find out now. Let's buzz over to our first story, shall we? Oh, it's the Diesel. I thought it was gonna be, but never mind. Anyway, this story is a delight, giving us readers the introductions of Bill and Ben as well as Boko. I love how these twins are different from the other twins we have already, them being Donald and Douglas. These twins are more mischievous, more chaotic, and a lot more childish than the Scottish pair, and I think they make for quite an interesting duo. We don't really get much insight into Boko's character, which is a bit unfortunate, but I'm sure the other stories will do a much better job at giving him a personality. Okay, now comes for my hot take. I think Bill and Ben should have been girls. The Railway series is so void of female engines, and I think introducing these two and having them be girls would make for a lot more interesting dynamics and interaction, as well as making the pair more distinguishable. I don't know, it's just a little idea that popped into my head as I was thinking about the story. It's still an enjoyable one nonetheless though, and is being put between Little Old Twins and Bad Lookout. Now, let's buzz over to our next story, shall we? Okay, here we are, Buzz Buzz. I think this story is quite overshadowed by its TV adaptation, which I find to be much better personally. In this story, James just goes back to the shed after the bees rest on his boiler. In the adaptation, he tries everything to get them off, ranging from going through tunnels to spinning around on the turntable. The one thing I will say it does well is showing the readers that Boko is really a good sort of diesel. James is rude to him, gets his comeuppance, and Boko gets James's express as a result. Simple story that needs no altering. Boko also gains some sort of personality. He's a lot like Edward but younger, and James calling him names was like water off a duck's back to him, which I like about him. He's a lot more interesting than in the TV series anyway. Buzz Buzz is going under bowled out but above Peter Sam and the refreshment lady. Let's buzz out. I can't do the joke anymore, you get the point. Next please. The more I think about Wrong Road, the more positive things I can come up with to say about it. I like that Awdry has built his fictional island and railway to be so lifelike that he can name times trains will depart. That's some dedication right there. I like that Boko can now manage Bill and Ben as if he's known them for ages. I like that Gordon gets comeuppance. I like the trick Bill and Ben play on him. I like how this whole situation comes about with the woman with the floppy green hat. There's a lot here to enjoy. The one criticism I do have is that only when Boko arrives does Awdry write about Gordon's distaste for him. Why couldn't that have been a thing earlier in the story that gets resolved later? There's no point bringing that up just as Gordon's about to change his opinion on diesels. It makes little sense. Show don't tell, Awdry. But yeah, Wrong Road's probably the best story from this book I've read so far. I'm putting it above Duck and Dukes but below Steamroller. Now for Edward's exploit, and oh boy is this one absolutely fantastic. I love how the illustrations show how dipped over Edward gets whilst pulling the train. His own side rod literally impales him, that's some Sodor Fallout material right there. Edward absolutely proves himself to the big engines, and that determination and care that we know the number 2 engine for comes shining through here. I also like how the story ends. Edward is sent off to be mended and Boko is accepted into the fleet. It's sweet, even if the little mention of Donald and Douglas at the end is a bit out of nowhere. I think the one critique I could give this story is that it's too short. I want more of Edward's journey to the point where he gets screwed over. Then it'd happily rest at the top of my list. But as it goes, Edward's exploit can sit happily in 5th place under Special Funnel, one of the most iconic tales of the franchise, to be sure. Overall, the word I'd use to describe mainline engines with is fantastic, and I think a lot of that is actually down to Boko. He is the main driving force behind this book and is a representation of how not all diesels are bad. In the first story he's presented as a thief before explaining he was misunderstood. He's mocked by James, who gets karma handed to him and has to live with the fact that Boko took his express. Then he saves Gordon from Bill and Ben, earning himself another brownie point. Finally he defends Edward to the other engines and is accepted into the fleet. He may not be the main character in many of the stories, but he is certainly a character that I've gained more appreciation for over the course of reading this book. Awdry's writing is slowly evolving from children's stories to just plain old literature at this point, and I'm cool with that. He wrote for a generation more so than an age group. Iconic of him. Let's see if that trend continues. I don't know about you, but I am feeling 22, and we are officially over halfway through. I am sorry for that awful cover, by the way. Anyway, Small Railway Engines follows the Arlesdale Railway along Duck's branch line. Well, not yet, but soon it will be. They're a group of miniature engines, smaller than Skarloey and his gang, and this book tells us about all of their adventures and shit. So will this book follow in Mountain Engine's footsteps, or will it be better or worse? I don't fucking know, I haven't read it yet. Ballast is your typical Awdry expositional story when setting up a new location, line or character. But what I think makes it stand out from other stories like Skarloey Remembers or Daisy is the fact that the character dynamics are so well written. Rex, Mike and Bert banter with each other and they're really charming because of that. It's also enjoyable to see them talk about their little line because I think the illustrations are really beautiful to match, so it creates this more magical like quality to it. I think in terms of illustrations, I would have liked to have seen one of Gordon, Henry, Donald and Douglas interacting. That's about my only complaint with them and the story as a whole really. It's a really solid start and it's going under bullseyes but above dirty work. I just hope that the next story is just as good. Tit for Tat is fine. Just fine. I don't hate it or anything, but it lacks all of the charm and magic-like quality the introductory story had. This is down to who appears in the story and what happens in it. The thin and fat clergymen are a good gimmick, but having them be the focus of the story instead of something like an old mine from the mid-Sodal that Bert finds or something takes away from the charm of their line and all of the mystery surrounding it. Also, because of these clergymen, it means that we get less interaction between the engines, who have some of the best dynamics of any characters I've seen from these books so far. The story's rather basic and plain, to be honest. There's nothing too positive or unique to point out about it, so it's going above Down the Mine, but under double heading. Mike's whistle is definitely an improvement. I love the character dynamics and the amusing fate that befalls Mike in the story. I think it is definitely on the shorter side, but that's not necessarily bad, and I think it is actually just the right length for the kind of story it is. Honestly, that's all I have to say on this one really. It's another rather menial story, but it has some entertainment value. Plus the knowledge that Duck got eggs stuck in his whistle is kinda funny, can't lie. It's going in between Henry's sneeze and bowled out. Thank you. Next. Again, I am really, really sorry. I don't know what I'm doing. It's not... Our last story of the book is Useful Railway, and it's decent. Again, nothing spectacular. I like the inclusion of Willie the farmhand, he seems amusing. Also, the character interaction is enjoyable to read once again, especially because all of the three engines all come together at the end. That's very sweet. What I would have liked to have seen more is the idea of the passengers thinking the Arlesdale Railway is a toy railway, just sprinkled in more throughout the book as a whole, as a more long-running theme. Similar to how Boko was treated in mainline engines, I think it would have made the ending more satisfying personally. Other than that, it's pretty solid, it's going under old iron. Nice. All in all, Small Railway Engines I'd describe as being decent. It has its moments, and I think especially that expositional story at the start is rather impressive, but it never quite brings back that magic-like feeling it had, despite the charm that came with the characters coming and going. Alright, let's move to the next book, shall we? Considered by many to be the best book of the Railway series, Enterprising Engines was released in 1968 and deals with heavy themes such as engine genocide and dieselisation across British railways. But do I think this book is all that many in the fandom claim it to be? I mean, probably, there's no smoke without fire, right? Let's take a gander anyway. Our first story of the book is Tenders for Henry, and it's pretty amusing. Despite the fact that the story does have this very hasty perspective change to Henry, it's charming, and the Flying Scotsman's here, so that's a bonus. I think it has a bit of a problem with its tonal whiplash though. It goes from Gordon being told that his brothers are all dead to Henry making a fool of himself. It's not as bad as it could have been because the Flying Scotsman arrives in between to make things more light-hearted, but I'm still not completely 100% with it. That though is literally the only problem I have with this one, I'm glad to say. Everything else is enjoyable and rather charming. I love Duck's little line mentioning that the Flying Scotsman was the second engine to go 100 miles per hour, which is a nice callback to domeless engines. I keep saying it's always the little details. The story is being sandwiched between trucks and bucking bronco. Super Rescue is next, and this takes every other engine fails but carries on story to the next level. This dude Henry was able to do all of what he did, aiding 2 trains despite him also being a failed engine as he so disappointedly worded it. That's badass. What I also like about this story is its origins. This idea for the story was sprung from a little boy's imagination that Awdry met on a train. That's pretty cute and brings this whole series back to its roots a little bit, reminding us all who the primary audience really is. The children. Another thing I like about this story is its clear demonstration of the good and bad kinds of diesels. 199 is a prick who whines and gives up at the first hurdle. 7101 is more considerate, shutting up the narcissistic 199 and trying to help Henry in any way he can despite having failed. The only thing I can critique on this story is that it focuses less on the parts you'd expect it to, being a story about an engine overcoming the odds. The passengers barely get a mention, it doesn't do the best job of showing how dicked over Henry is, shit like that. However, it really is a good one despite that, and that's why it's between the Flying Kipper and Thomas Goes Fishing. Escape is as fun as the TV adaptation, let me tell you, although I do have my problems as per. I feel like there maybe should have been more build-up to Douglas meeting Oliver, instead he just does. There's something very off about that, especially considering how absent Douglas has been from the book so far. However, that does mean we get straight to the action and we get some information about Oliver's escape that we never got in the episode, which is a neat addition. I'm also not a fan of how the conclusion has been postponed to the final story. That's not very cool. I was looking forward to reading that. But everything else, as per with these books at this point, is really enjoyable. The action, the suspense, the narrative, all very well done and great to read. So with all that considered, Escape is going under the Diesel but above Bad Lookout. Little Western rounds up this pantheon of stories and it's decent. It's really just devoted to cleaning up the previous stories, talking about Oliver joining the railway and 7101 being renamed to Bear and being accepted into the fleet. Sure, it's interesting, but it's more exposition than an actual story, and it tells what happens instead of showing it, and that's probably why it's the weakest of this book. I'll put it between Safe from Scrap and Mountain Engine. Not the worst, but not the best either. The word I'd use to describe Enterprising Engines is gritty. It's a lot more serious, dealing with those heavy themes of Gordon's brothers dying and a fugitive escaping from Scrap, but that doesn't mean it can't be fun. The first 2 stories are evidence of that. This book is decent, although I don't think it's one that's high up there for me as it would be for most people. If you love this one and it's your favourite, good for you, I'm glad it is, but I don't think it's mine out of the ones we've read so far. Originally called Little Western Engines, Oliver the Western Engine follows not only the title character, but Duck, Donald, and other various characters sprinkled across this branch line. Let's be fair, Little Western Engines is a far superior title, but is this a superior book? We won't know until we've read it, I guess, and there's no better place to start than the beginning. Donald's Duck is quite sweet, although a bit menial. It's charming and quite enjoyable, but in my opinion, nothing revolutionary. It serves its purpose, and that's it. It also doesn't help that these are 2 characters that I'm not all that bothered about. Duck and Donald are both fine, and this story does make me like them a bit more than I did, but I don't know, I've never really been the biggest fan of this one. It can go under Train Stops Play, but above Save from Scrap. Up next we have Resource and Sagacity, and whilst it is just that typical engine is humbled by embarrassing experience story, the way it's written and the illustrations just make it absolutely beautiful and such a great read. That gimmick of Oliver falling down the turntable well also helps it stick out too. Another little side note here, but I really like how Awdry has tuned down Donald and Douglas's phonetically written speech. You can see that clearly he's learning and evolving his writing to fit what the audience desires while still keeping it true to himself and entertaining. Gotta give him props for that. I'll put this story between Thomas and the Trucks and Dirty Work, because I really liked it. Toad Stands By is really charming and really fun. I had a really good time with this story. It revolves around the trucks mocking Oliver and Oliver biting back accidentally in the most morbid of ways. He rips the leader of said trucks, Scruffy, in half. What a badass. The writing and the illustrations as per really make this story feel more alive through Scruffy's begging for Oliver to stop and the brutal illustrations where the truck is in pieces. And the best part is that I don't feel sorry for him because of how he treated Oliver. He is shown to have no sympathetic qualities or any sort of empathy, so when he gets his cruel demise it feels rightfully deserved in the eyes of the reader. It's stuff like that that reminds me why I love the Railway series as much as I do, and in turn this has really made me want to go back to the episode adaptation as well, which is also really entertaining. Toad Stands By has such a plethora of good qualities that if I tried listing them, I'd be here all day. I'm putting it above Percy's Promise but below Edward's Exploit, right near the top there. Now, I've got to be honest, I'm really not in the mood to review this last story, even if it is a fucking corker. So would anyone like to lend a hand? I said, would anyone like to lend a hand? Ginger Engine, that's your cue.
Sorry everybody.
No worries, take it away.
Thanks Peter Sam. Anyway, hello my fellow Steamies. These are my thoughts on the story Awdry. There's lots of things that I love about this story in particular in this Railway series book, but I'll narrow it down to the main points. First one is Awdry himself. Awdry is one of the best road warrior characters, as I dubbed them, in the Railway series. George is a very close second in terms of Railway series canon, but I think Awdry really set up what the anarchist style of the roads v rails could be going forward if Awdry had continued with his stories. Awdry's very sneaky, he's deceptive, he's manipulative, and he'll do whatever it takes to get the roads on top over the rails. And also the line, "Yeah, boo Stubbs," is something that I just absolutely killed myself laughing the first time I heard it. Still don't know what it means, so if anybody does know, please give it a shout. The second thing that I like about this story is that it builds on the Oliver and Duck pairing that we were getting in this book. I know we get hints of it in the other stories, but I think this is the one where they really come together because they have a common goal. They want to make sure that the roads do not succeed against the rails, that they get their passengers back, and that they get one up over on Awdry. It also shows how Duck can be pretty sadistic. Like he's driving over a bridge which could potentially crush Awdry, and he's just like, yeah, that would serve you right. So yeah, I think he's got a bit of a murderous streak in him. It's a fantastic story from a great book, and if you've not read it already, then well, what are you doing watching this video? Go and get it read. Again, thanks to Peter Sam for letting me contribute to this video, and until next time, keep on jugging.
Bulgy is going between Devil's Back and Old Faithful. I really like that one too, thanks Andrew. So Oliver the Western Engine is definitely an enjoyable book in my opinion, and the word I'd use to describe this one is delightful. With so many fun characters making up the pages, all written in the most entertaining of ways, with the most attractive illustrations. I'm saying all this now because we don't have long left until the Dissension, as I like to refer to it. Scary times. Scary times. Duke the Lost Engine is the 25th book of the Railway series and was originally planned to be the final one of the series by Wilbur. It's the book that explains everything from the old tracks of the Arsdale Railway to the origins of Peter, Sam and Sir Handel, and even the story Duck and Dukes. But are these stories just expositional pieces of a puzzle put together, or is there more to it than that? I mean, most of the fans love it, so I'm assuming there's more. We're obviously starting with Grandpuff, and yes, we all know it's brilliant. Literally everything it does is amazing, and it's so clear how much thought was put behind it. Duke is an amazingly enjoyable character, brimming with personality and tales to tell, like the one with number 2. To be honest, I don't have much to say other than it's enjoyable and really well written, with some absolute fucking masterpieces of illustrations to go alongside it. Gonna put it in a solid second place, right under Gallant Old Engine. That story still beats it out for me, but only just. Next up is Bulldog. Oh, by the way, forgot to mention that the next segment ranking will be after Tramway Engines because I thought you guys would like to see a larger segment ranking at the end. Anyway, this story is a rather enjoyable one, seeing the passengers and Duke's determination to not let Falcon fall despite him having been so rude is very sweet, as well as Falcon apologising at the end. The literal one critique I have of this story is that one illustration that depicts Falcon and number 2 in the same shed as number 2 is still an engine. That sort of weakens Falcon's reaction to seeing number 2 be turned into a generator in Grandpuff if he was there when it happened. That's it. My favourite bit of this story has to be when Duke says he only held on to Falcon because he had a new coat of paint. You can tell he didn't mean it, and yet he didn't want to let on that he's nice. It's that sort of showing of character that I absolutely adore when it comes to this book. I'm putting this one between Thomas and the Breakdown Train and Pop Goes the Diesel. You Can't Win is next, and is infamously my favourite episode from my favourite season. Here though, there just seems to be something missing. I have no idea what it is, but to me, the TV adaptation will always be superior to the story. I mean, everything that made the last story so enjoyable is still in here, and it's obviously still going to end up high on the list because of the writing and so on, but for me, there's just something missing that made the TV adaptation so magical. Could be the music, could be the narration, I don't know. The one thing that did bug me that I could pick out is the fact that Stuart says for crying out loud instead of the more comical fiddlesticks, but that's about it. Oh well, I'll put it under Little Old Twins but above the Diesel. Still an enjoyable tale. It's hard not to smile at Sleeping Beauty, as it's the perfect ending to this extraordinary book. Especially that last page where, sure, things have changed, but the dynamics that Handel and Peter Sam share with Duke is still there. But it's not just that, it's that community spirit coming into play, where everyone helps out from all corners of the railway to help find Duke. The small engines, Donald, the clergyman of course, they're all brought together to help with this one event, and it's so amazing to see. It's that feeling of triumph and power that makes this all so special, and that is why I am probably going to put this one at the top of the list. It's the ultimate magnum opus of the railway series, showing the audience through their own reactions how attached they are to the characters they've come to know, and using that to make a powerful, emotive, satisfying ending to this book. And if it hadn't been for Tramway Engines, the whole railway series, I could only dream of doing shit like that to that degree. This isn't a crappy little fairy tale about choo-choo trains, this is a masterpiece. In fact, that's the word I'd use to describe Duke the Lost Engine. Masterpiece, because let's be fair, it definitely is. I love this book so much. It answers questions, it gives us lore, it provides entertaining characters, it has some funny moments.
They enlarge the fat clergyman's hole.
It has some sad moments, but most of all, it's heartwarming. And that is why Duke the Lost Engine gets the praise that it does. Well, we know the next book probably won't beat all that, but it doesn't mean it can't be good at all. Let's see, shall we? The final Wilbur Awdry book, and the final book to be illustrated by Gunvor and Peter Edwards, Tramway Engines, was released in 1972. It focused on Thomas and all of the shit he was up to on his branch line. We even have a friendly new face joining the engines in there. But that's all in good time. Let's start at the beginning first. Ghost Train is an amazing first story, full of amusement and beautiful nighttime illustrations. The story goes that Thomas doesn't believe in Percy's ghosts and mocks him for it, resulting in Percy getting his own back on Thomas after he crashes into a lime cart. I really do just love the dynamics here. All of the characters really do feel like they're interacting with each other just like your average humans would. Percy's great, Thomas is a delight to see in that kind of situation, and Toby's just Toby, sitting at the sidelines watching everything happen with a chaotic grin, and I love it. The only thing I could critique this story on is that Thomas really does act cold-heartedly when he fully believes that Percy has straight up died. That's quite sad to see, to be honest, but that's only one little thing. I'm placing it under rock and roll but above a close shave. Woolly Bear is very much the parallel to Ghost Train, and that just makes me appreciate both of these so much more. Ghost Train sees Thomas humiliated, Woolly Bear has Percy look a fool. Ghost Train is set at night time, this story is set in the daytime. The dynamics are still just as strong, and I actually prefer the illustrations in this story to the one of the previous, especially with the one of Percy looking at himself in the mirror, all fuzzy looking. I think for those reasons, I'm putting Woolly Bear just under Ghost Train. There's a lot of little details in Mavis that once you notice them you can't unnotice them, such as the tractor that has a face if you look closely, or the fact the sheds in the background of the illustration where Toby comes to help Mavis implies he was watching Mavis from 10 yards away as she was sitting there struggling for like 20 minutes. It's clever and adds another layer of enjoyability to the story. However, the story itself is rather dull. There's some great dynamics in there, such as Mavis and Toby or Mavis and Daisy, but what occurs just isn't as interesting as it could have been. I'm putting this story below Old Iron but above Useful Railway. It does well with what it is, and I respect that. Toby's Tightrope is a great end to the end of the Awdry books. It's tense, interesting, entertaining, and whilst probably not as good as the first two stories, is a fun read nonetheless. The illustrations are top notch as is the writing. This really is just your typical late end Awdry story with fun characters, a solid story, and enjoyable illustrations. I really don't know what else to say besides that. Oh yeah, I'm putting this one above the Flying Kipper, but below Super Rescue, a fitting end to one of the best writers out there. So that's all of the Awdry stuff. The word I'd use to describe Tramway Engines is fitting. It's a fitting end to this man's career with the most popular trio of characters he created, loved by young and old fans. So this is the end of part 1, and I am worn the fuck out. Luckily, part 2 won't be as taxing, as we have less books and far less fun stories to cover for the most part, with Chris Awdry's 16 volumes from really useful engines to Thomas and his friends, as well as the final ranking at the end. But until that fateful day, I've been Peter Sam, you've been you, and I'm off to find the fat clergyman's hole.